was he on about? My body, mister, come figure it out with the Sonnet sisters. Good dawning to thee, friends, and welcome to episode 2B of Sonnet Sisters. In this episode, I will be doing a bit more of a closer analysis at sonnet number 2.
What is the meaning of this?
Okay, so first things first, let's look at the words that I was a little bit iffy about. Starting with livery. So livery pops up in the third line. Thy youth's proud livery, so gazed on now. When I was reading it through the first time, I said I wasn't quite sure what it meant. And I had assumed it was something to do with money, because that is a piece of imagery that's used later on. And so I linked it back to that. Now, I was close. That was not a bad thing to do, is if you're not sure, have a look at the other imagery that's going on and link it to something like that. But I was incorrect that it has anything to do with money, despite my really clever Sherlock Holmes detective work of saying that it was similar to livre, which is the French for pound. It's nothing to do with that. Livery is in fact just a type of uniform. So when the line says, thy youth's proud livery, so gazed on now, will be a tattered weed of small worth held. Weed actually was not just a word for annoying plants that grow in your garden. It was a word that would be used to describe clothing. Like we sometimes say, oh, you've got nice threads. It was kind of like that. So a tattered weed is saying that the clothing is kind of all grubby and roughed up. In those two lines, line 3 and line 4, to say thy youth's proud livery, so gazed on now, will be a tattered weed of small worth held, is using clothing as a metaphor for the subject's face. So it's saying that your proud uniform that everyone looks at now, the uniform of your body and your face, will be really tatty and old, like an old charity shop jacket, essentially. And it won't be worth anything. So yeah, actually the charity shop thing is not a bad example, because it will now be worth just a few pounds and nothing much else at all. So that's what livery means. Next, I'm just going to clarify thriftless in line 8. So line 7 leads in to say within thine own deep sunken eyes were an all-eating shame and thriftless praise. Now, thriftless means kind of spending money in a really reckless manner. So not being very clever with your money, basically, just kind of chucking it around. So this leads me on really nicely to the next thing I wanted to talk about, which is the imagery within this poem. There are 3 very clear sort of metaphors going on in here, and uses of imagery. The first one being sort of battle and military images. So they pop up in the first couple of lines and kind of segue into the third line as well. So when 40 winters shall besiege thy brow and dig deep trenches in thy beauty's field. So besiege, trenches and field, they're all very army type images. And it gives this sense of a battle. So not just army in general, but specifically on a battlefield, it has that idea. So it's quite a violent opening to the poem, of coming in and immediately likening the aging process that's going to happen, likening that to a battle, an army battle. That's quite a strong opening. And then moving on to the next line, thy youth's proud livery, so gazed on now. Now livery means uniform, so that again ties in with the military thing. And then it goes off on a slight, not tangent, but it digs into that clothing imagery a bit deeper with will be a tattered weed of small worth held, which I spoke about earlier. So they're the first 2 sets of images that get used within those first 4 lines, so within the first quatrain. The recurring theme that's going on throughout this is money. There's a constant comparison, talking about beauty as if it were money, as if your youth and your beauty are things that you can kind of save up and choose how you spend them, in the same way that we do with money. It first pops up in line 6, where all the treasure of thy lusty days, and then it talks about thriftless praise, and it says thy beauty's use, which isn't a direct money reference, but it's interesting to talk about beauty as being something that you should use as opposed to just have. And that's the suggestion that comes with the comparison to money. If thou couldst answer, this fair child of mine shall sum my count. yeah, it's really interesting saying, basically, if you are given beauty, you shouldn't just spend it recklessly, which I guess could mean, I mean, with the line lusty days, I suppose that could mean kind of putting it about or flirting with lots of people or whatever to get your own way, and just carrying on like that for yourself, using it for yourself, I suppose, kind of selfishly. That instead you should invest your beauty in having a child, because your beauty won't last forever. Like money runs out, so beauty runs out. If you have children, then you're kind of investing your beauty and it will still exist and you won't have used it up, so that even when you've run out, you still have an example of it there in your child. So pretty much what I was saying from the blind reading, which is good. So I don't think there's anything else that I particularly want to delve deeper in there, except just that it's suggesting that it is selfish to keep your beauty to yourself and not have children, and that it's a waste, actually. Not just selfish, but it's a waste of your beauty, and you're not using it, you're not doing anything with it. So the last thing that I wanted to talk about here, in these sections, I'd quite like to each time look at a different way that I tend to approach written Shakespeare for performance, because it's one thing to read a poem through just by reading it with your eyes, but it's another thing to put it into your own body and to speak it, especially to speak it in front of other people and to try and get meaning across. So with each of these videos, I'm going to look at one small thing that helps me on my journey towards performance. I won't do all of them every time, because there's a lot of things that I would do to prepare myself to be able to speak a big chunk of Shakespeare, of verse specifically. So I'm going to start first and foremost with the most basic part of speaking any Shakespeare verse, the iambic pentameter. So what I do when I first get a speech or a sonnet, a big chunk of Shakespearean verse, is I go through and find where all the stresses are, where sort of mathematically the beats should fall if you're going ba-dum, 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 ba-dum. Once I've gone through that, there might be places where it feels unnatural to follow precisely. For example, that line, "Thy youth's proud livery." I mean, that sounds very weird to say it like that. "Thy youth's proud livery so gazed on now." I would say, personally there, that it would read clearer, "Thy youth's proud livery so gazed on now." So that puts "thy youth's proud livery." I would get rid of the stress on re of livery. So you've got stressed and then unstressed and then re unstressed. And then I would put a stress on so gazed on now. So you've got two next to each other there. So once I've gone through a speech in that way and found all the places where I feel the beats naturally fall and places where it feels like it's switched round, then I'll read it through and listen very carefully to where those stresses are, because they usually give you a sense of the important word or the important part of the word within that line, or words plural. So it comes out very clearly. If I'm going to overdo this now so that you can really hear which parts of the verse are being emphasised. "When 40 winters shall besiege thy brow, and dig deep trenches in thy beauty's field, thy youth's proud livery, so gazed on now, will be a tattered weed of small worth held." You really get a sense of certain words coming out stronger. 40 winters. Putting the stress on 40 winters. It feels like, again, very harsh because it's talking about winters. You could just as well say 40 summers, because that would be 40 years as well, but he's chosen winters specifically because it's harsher. That's just an example, and obviously you can do this all the way through. I'll try not to do that, although I do love the bit, "and see thy blood warm," blood pops out, "and see thy blood warm when thou feelst it cold." So feel and cold as well. So doing that really highlights the sort of really interesting and fun words, and it also steers you towards the right direction of how to read it and where the emphasis does actually fall and what the important parts and the important messages within the poem are. So that's just one exercise that I'll always start off with everything I'm doing, just to give me a head start to highlight a few bits that I may not have noticed beforehand. Now, when it comes to performing this, I would love it to be a kind of sister-brother relationship, mainly because it is quite harsh, that beginning, and I feel like to be able to say to someone, when you get old and ugly, like that feels kind of quite playful and intimate. I mean, in the sonnet it doesn't necessarily sound playful, but that's because of the context at the time. But I think that this would work really well modern day if there was just a touch of playful kind of digging at somebody, which I feel is a very sort of sibling-esque relationship going on. And that the person speaking, it clearly feels to me as if the person speaking does actually have a child of their own. And I think that particularly comes out in the line, "This child of mine." It's obviously suggesting this is something that you could say, but it also feels to me that that has come from a place of reality, of someone who does have a child and who really values having children and is glad that they have children. So for me, I'd like this sonnet to be delivered from the perspective of someone who does have kids already and loves that they have kids, who is trying to persuade someone else who's maybe a little bit vain, who enjoys the way that they look, maybe someone who's a bit of a player, encouraging them that they should settle down and have kids, as is the main theme of the poem and of the first 17 poems, in fact. So tune back in on Saturday to see what I end up doing with this. It may just be me talking to a camera, or it may be me talking to another person sat next to me so that I can actually deliver it to them, because I feel that's helpful. Or who knows, I might be able to get the resources and the time together to actually film it in the setting that I see in my head of in someone's house and get somebody to play my brother. We'll see what happens, we'll see what's doable. But those are my ideas, and those are the things that kind of popped out to me looking at it in more detail. Alright, I'll see you on Saturday.